The war between the Galactic Empire of Sorel and the Terran Republic was on the brink of destruction. For years, both sides had fought bitterly, leaving entire planets in ruins. Now the final battle was approaching, and humanity knew they might not survive. Captain Daniel Cross, a Terran diplomat, sat in the Grand Chamber of the Cyrelian High Council. The alien rulers, their shimmering silver skin glowing under the artificial lights, stared at him with unreadable expressions. He was surrounded by towering alien warriors, their sharp, feline-like eyes watching his every move. Daniel had been sent here for one reason: to stop the war before it was too late. But what the Cyrelian Emperor proposed next shocked him. A marriage, the Emperor said in his deep, echoing voice. Between our princess and you, human. A bond that will unite our species. If you agree, the war ends. If not, we continue the fight, and your people will perish. Daniel felt his heart race. Marriage. To an alien princess, it sounded absurd. This wasn't part of the negotiation plan. At that moment, the princess stepped forward. Soraya Sorel, the heir to the empire, was unlike any Cyrelian he had seen before. She was tall, with sleek silver hair and piercing violet eyes. Her expression was cold, emotionless, as if she didn't care about his reaction. "This is just a formality," she said, her voice sharp. "A symbol of unity. Nothing more." Daniel swallowed hard. He was a soldier, a negotiator, not a husband. But he knew what was at stake. If he refused, humanity could face complete destruction. Millions of lives depended on his answer. "And if I agree?" he asked, trying to sound calm. The Emperor's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "Then you will be part of our royal house. The war will end immediately. No more bloodshed." Daniel glanced at Soraya. She was staring at him as if he were nothing more than a tool, a necessary sacrifice for peace. There was no warmth, no kindness, just duty. He took a deep breath. He didn't come all this way to fail. "Fine," he said, his voice steady. "I'll do it. I'll marry the princess." The room fell silent. Then the Emperor nodded. "Good. The ceremony will be prepared at once." Daniel exhaled, feeling the weight of his decision sink in. He had just agreed to something insane, a fake marriage to an alien princess. But in the back of his mind, one thought lingered. What if this isn't just a formality? What if there's more to this than they're telling me? As Soraya turned away without another word, Daniel knew one thing for sure: his life would never be the same again. Daniel stood in the center of a massive hall, surrounded by towering alien figures. The Cyrelian royal palace was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls glowed with a soft silver light, and the ceiling looked like an endless galaxy, filled with stars that moved. He wore a strange ceremonial robe, deep blue with silver embroidery. It felt heavy on his shoulders, just like the responsibility he had taken. Across from him stood Princess Soraya Sorel, her expression blank, her violet eyes unreadable. The hall was silent as the Cyrelian high priest stepped forward. His glowing hands lifted an ancient staff, and he spoke in the Cyrelian tongue. Daniel didn't understand a word. He had been told the ceremony was just a symbolic act, a political formality. He had nothing to worry about. But something felt off. The priest turned to him and placed a silver ring in his hand. It was cold, too cold, almost alive. "Repeat after me," Soraya said, her voice flat. She spoke in perfect English, her tone indifferent. Daniel hesitated, then followed her words. The ring in his hand started glowing softly. The priest then handed Soraya a similar ring, and she spoke a few Cyrelian words. As she slipped the ring onto Daniel's finger, a strange warmth rushed through his body. A soft golden thread of light connected their rings, weaving through the air like a living energy. Daniel's breath caught. He could feel something inside him shift, like an invisible bond tightening around his very soul. The crowd began to cheer, their alien voices echoing through the hall. Soraya turned to him, her face unreadable. It is done. The Emperor stepped forward. The bond is complete. The war is over. Let it be known. Daniel Cross is now part of the Relian royal house. Daniel exhaled. He had done it. He had saved humanity. But before he could feel any relief, he noticed something strange. His ring wouldn't come off. He tugged at it slightly, but it stayed in place. He frowned. Okay, what exactly did I just agree to? Soraya met his gaze, her voice calm but sharp. You are my husband now, and in Xyrelian law, marriage is permanent. Daniel froze. Wait, what? Soraya's eyes narrowed. Did you think this was just for show? The marriage bond is real, human. You are bound to me, in name, in duty, and in life. His heart pounded. This wasn't just a fake political marriage. This was forever. Daniel sat in a grand chamber, staring at the golden ring on his finger. No matter how much he twisted and pulled, it wouldn't come off. He had thought this was a temporary arrangement, a political move to stop the war. But now he realized the truth. He was trapped. Across the room, Princess Soraya Xyrel stood tall, her violet eyes cold as ever. She barely glanced at him as she spoke to the royal advisors in her native tongue. The tension in the room was thick. The war had ended, but Daniel's personal battle was just beginning. He took a deep breath and stepped toward her. Soraya, we need to talk. She turned slowly, arching an eyebrow. About what husband? The way she said the word sent a shiver down his spine. This bond, he said, lifting his hand to show the glowing ring. How do we undo it? The room went silent. The Xyrelian advisors exchanged amused glances, while Soraya's lips curled into a smirk, just slightly. Undo it, she repeated, as if the idea was absurd. There is no undoing, Daniel. Xyrelian marriages are for life. The only way to break the bond is if both partners willingly reject it. And she took a step closer, her gaze locking onto his. Do not. Daniel clenched his jaw. You can't be serious. You don't even like me. Soraya tilted her head. That is irrelevant. You are now part of the royal house. You will fulfill your duties. Duties? The thought made his stomach twist. He wasn't a royal. He wasn't some alien prince. He was a Terran soldier, a diplomat, a man who just wanted to go home. He shook his head. No, this wasn't the deal. I agreed to stop the war, not become somewhat. Soraya interrupted, her voice sharp. A king. A partner. You agreed, human. And now you must live with the consequences. Daniel ran a frustrated hand through his hair. He wasn't sure what angered him more, her arrogance or the fact that she was right. The Xyrelian emperor cleared his throat. You will adjust, Daniel Cross. You are now bound to us. And as long as you remain, the peace between our worlds will hold. Daniel felt like the walls were closing in. He had just saved humanity, but at what cost? As he turned away, Soraya's voice stopped him. Do not fight this, human. The more you resist, the harder it will be. Daniel took a deep breath. He wasn't going to accept this. Not yet. One way or another, he would find a way out of this. But what he didn't realize was that the bond was already changing him. Days passed, and the world outside seemed to move on while Daniel's life remained stuck in a prison of royal duties. The war had ended, but his battle had just begun. As Princess Soraya Xyrel's husband, he was expected to attend endless meetings, make public appearances, and live among the alien nobility. And all the while, he felt more like a puppet than a man. The Xyrelian palace was a place of constant motion. Servants scurried about, strange foods were served at every meal, and the alien nobles treated him like a curiosity. He had never felt so out of place. He didn't understand their customs, their languages, or even their ways of thinking. But the worst part, Soraya, she acted as if he were nothing more than a decoration, a piece of her royal life to be kept in line. Her eyes would often flicker to him during events, her gaze cold and distant. She rarely spoke to him unless necessary, and when she did, it was with the same detached tone she had used during their wedding. One evening, during a grand banquet to celebrate the new alliance, Daniel sat at the table, surrounded by alien faces, trying his best to follow the conversation. The food was strange, the drinks even stranger, and no one seemed interested in him, except for a few curious looks from Soraya's political rivals. His thoughts drifted back to Earth, to his family, his life. Before all of this, he missed the freedom, the simplicity. He was a soldier, not a husband, certainly not a royal one. He didn't belong here. Yet, here he was, stuck in a palace with a marriage he didn't want. Soraya's voice broke his thoughts. Don't just sit there looking lost. You must make an impression, Daniel. He glanced at her, surprised by the sharpness in her words. I didn't ask for this, Soraya. I'm not here to make an impression. I'm just trying to survive. She narrowed her eyes, her tone colder than ice. Survival is a luxury. You will learn to adapt. The sooner you do, the better for both of us. Her words stung. He had hoped there was more to this, some understanding, some connection. But it was clear now, this wasn't just a diplomatic marriage. It was a political tool, a means to secure peace, and he was just a pawn in a much bigger game. As the banquet continued, Daniel tried to ignore the feeling of being trapped. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he wasn't just a prisoner to Sarelian politics. He was also a prisoner to her. The thought made him uneasy, but there was no escape. At least, not yet. A few hours later, Daniel found himself alone in a dark hallway, far away from the celebration. He was lost in thought when he heard a soft voice from behind him. You're avoiding me, human. It was Soraya, her tone different, more curious than cold. He turned to face her, but before he could speak, she added, Don't think for a moment that you can run away from this. You're bound to me now. To us. Daniel met her eyes. I'm not running, Soraya. I'm just trying to understand where I fit in all of this. For the first time, he saw something shift in her expression, a crack in her cold exterior. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She turned away, her voice quiet but firm. You will learn, eventually. He wasn't so sure. The atmosphere in the palace was tense, more so than ever before. Daniel had just finished a strategy meeting with Soraya's council when the unexpected happened. He was walking down one of the many long corridors of the palace when he heard a sharp metallic sound. Then, a sudden shout. Before he could react, a figure rushed toward him, a figure cloaked in black. The assassin moved fast, but Daniel's instincts kicked in just as the man reached him, slashing a hidden blade at his chest. Without thinking, Daniel stepped aside, grabbed the attacker's arm, and twisted it. The man cried out in pain, but before Daniel could do anything else, a voice rang out, cold and authoritative. Enough. It was Soraya. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her violet eyes sharp and unblinking. Without waiting for anyone to move, she raised her hand, and two of her guards immediately rushed forward to subdue the assassin. Daniel watched, breathless, as the guards took control of the situation. The assassin was dragged away, his struggle futile against the superior strength of the Hyrelian warriors. Soraya walked over to Daniel, her face unreadable. Are you hurt? Daniel shook his head, still processing what had just happened. No. But what in the world was that? Soraya didn't answer at first. She looked down the hallway at the guards as they dragged the would-be assassin away, then turned her gaze back to Daniel. An attempt on your life. Clearly, someone doesn't like our union. Daniel's mind raced. He had thought that maybe, just maybe, this whole thing would blow over, but now he realized that there were enemies, both within and outside the palace, who were more than willing to see him dead. He was trapped, and not just by the marriage, but by the danger that came with being a royal in an alien empire. Soraya stepped closer, her eyes studying him, her voice softer than usual. "You need to be more careful. This marriage makes you a target, whether you like it or not." He didn't need her to tell him that. He was already aware that his life was no longer his own. But what struck him was the strangely protective tone in her voice. He met her gaze. "Why do you care? You barely even look at me most of the time." Soraya didn't flinch. She simply shrugged, her cold expression returning. "Because you are mine, and no one gets to take what belongs to me." Daniel's heart raced as the weight of her words sank in. She wasn't just talking about politics or peace. There was something more there, something deeper. Possessiveness, protection. He wasn't sure, but for the first time since their wedding, he felt like he might understand her a little more. But before he could respond, Soraya's tone became more urgent. "We need to move. There are more dangers in the shadows than you realize." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The reality of his situation was becoming all too clear. He wasn't just fighting for peace. He was fighting to survive in a world that was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Soraya was right about one thing. He was bound to her now, whether he liked it or not. And as much as he hated it, he realized that in some strange way, he might need her just as much as she needed him. For better or for worse, their fates were now intertwined. Daniel spent the next few days in a haze of uncertainty, his mind clouded by the assassination attempt and the strange events that followed. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught between two worlds, one that he didn't understand and one that he couldn't escape. The marriage, which had started as a political agreement, was quickly becoming something much more complicated. Soraya had been distant ever since the attack, and Daniel couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. Was she simply a cold ruler, or was there more to her than the icy exterior she showed everyone? Despite the tension between them, Daniel couldn't deny that there were moments when he felt like he was starting to see the real Soraya, a woman burdened by a crown, trapped in her own pride and duty. But he couldn't figure out if that made her more human or more alien. That afternoon, Daniel was summoned to a private meeting with Soraya. As he entered the royal chamber, he noticed her standing by the window, staring out at the alien city below. Her posture was perfect, regal, as always, but there was something in the way she held herself that made her seem distant, lost in thought. "You wanted to see me?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Soraya turned, her eyes scanning him for a moment before she spoke. "We need to talk." Daniel nodded, but he didn't know what to expect. They hadn't had a real conversation since the wedding. He'd been too caught up in the whirlwind of politics and danger, and she had always kept her distance, as though he were nothing more than a necessary inconvenience. "About the assassination?" Daniel asked, his tone more serious now. Soraya shook her head. "No, not that." She took a deep breath. "About us." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Us? There is no us. We're just a political arrangement, Soraya. That's all this is." For a moment, Soraya's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Daniel thought he saw a flash of vulnerability in her gaze. "You're wrong," she said softly. "You don't understand what this marriage means to me, to my people, to my legacy." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. "I'm not here for your legacy, Soraya. I'm here because I had no choice." Soraya's face hardened again, but there was a flicker of something deeper behind her eyes. "You think I wanted this?" Her voice was quieter now, as though she was admitting something she had been too proud to say before. "You think I wanted to be bound to a human, a species I was taught to fear and distrust. I didn't ask for this either." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was there more to her feelings than the cold pride she had always shown? Soraya continued, her voice almost breaking. "But I am a princess. I have duties, and those duties come before everything else. Before me. Before you. Before what I want." Daniel's frustration began to melt away, replaced by a strange, reluctant understanding. "I get it," he said quietly. "You're trapped in your own role, just like I'm trapped in this marriage. Soraya looked at him, her expression softening for the briefest moment. "I never wanted to be a prisoner of my own pride," she admitted. The silence between them stretched, but this time it wasn't filled with tension. Instead, it felt like a quiet moment of truth. Daniel knew that neither of them was truly free. They were both bound by duty, by honor, by the consequences of choices neither of them had fully made. But despite everything, despite their differences and the walls between them, Daniel began to realize something. They were more alike than they both cared to admit. The days following their conversation were filled with unease. Daniel could feel the tension in the air, as if something was coming, something he couldn't predict. The palace seemed quieter, as if everyone knew something he didn't. Soraya remained distant, but her cold exterior had softened ever so slightly. She still treated him like a necessary tool, but there were moments when he thought he saw a flicker of something more in her eyes. He couldn't put his finger on it, but his relationship with Soraya was evolving, whether he liked it or not. Despite the strange bond between them, he knew he had to stay alert. The political landscape was treacherous, and the people of the Tyrellian court were not forgiving. One evening, after another long and tiring meeting, Daniel walked the palace grounds alone. The stars above him seemed so distant, so unreachable, and for a moment, he felt the weight of his situation pressing down on him. He wasn't just a human on an alien planet anymore. He was now royalty, bound to an alien princess, a pawn in a political game that was far beyond his understanding. As he wandered deeper into the gardens, he was suddenly stopped by a figure emerging from the shadows. Daniel instinctively reached for the hidden weapon at his side, but the figure spoke before he could act. "You've been a fool, human." Daniel froze. It was Lord Viric, one of the most powerful and dangerous members of Soraya's court. His expression was filled with contempt, and his voice was thick with venom. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his tone steady. Lord Viric smirked, clearly enjoying Daniel's confusion. "You think this marriage is real, that Soraya cares for you. She doesn't. You're just a tool to secure peace, nothing more." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had always suspected that Soraya wasn't completely honest with him, but this was different. Viric's words made him question everything. "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel demanded, trying to hide his growing unease. Viric leaned closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "Because you are a threat to us. You're human, and you don't belong here. And the longer you stay, the more the Tyrellian court will resist the alliance you represent. The princess will betray you, just as she betrayed us all." Daniel felt his blood run cold. Betrayal. He had been used. And now, it seemed, that the Tyrellian court was ready to dispose of him. But then, something clicked in his mind. This wasn't just about Soraya's politics. Viric was trying to manipulate him, to turn him against Soraya in the hope of breaking their bond. "I'm not afraid of you, Viric," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the anger rising in him. "If Soraya wanted me gone, she would have made it happen already. She's not the one you should worry about." Viric sneered. "You're a fool if you think she'll protect you. You're nothing but a pawn in this game, and soon you'll realize it." With that, Viric disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Daniel standing alone in the garden, his mind racing. He had been warned, but it didn't make the situation any easier to understand. Daniel didn't know if he could trust Soraya anymore. But what he did know was that he couldn't let her or anyone else manipulate him. He wasn't just a human, he was a fighter. And no matter the stakes, he was going to fight for his survival. Daniel's mind raced as he walked back to the palace, the words of Lord Viric still echoing in his ears. Betrayal. The word felt like a weight on his chest, sinking deeper with every step. He had come here with one mission: to stop the war. But now he felt more like a pawn in a game he didn't understand. As he entered the royal chambers, Soraya was already waiting for him. She stood by the large window, her back to him, staring out at the glittering city below. She looked as regal as ever, her silver hair cascading down her back, her posture perfect. But there was something different in the air tonight, something that made the tension between them feel sharper than usual. Daniel didn't say anything at first. He wasn't sure if he could trust her anymore, not after everything he had learned. He was still shaken from his encounter with Lord Vierick, and the more he thought about it, the more everything seemed like a carefully crafted lie. Soraya turned when she heard him enter, her eyes scanning him carefully, as if trying to gauge his mood. "You look troubled, human." Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of something else, something he couldn't place. He met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. "I am troubled, Soraya." The words came out before he could stop them. "I don't know what to believe anymore. Is everything we've built just a lie?" Soraya's eyes flickered with something. Surprise, maybe even guilt. She crossed the room in a few strides, stopping just a few feet away from him. "What do you mean?" Her voice was softer now, almost fragile, as if she had dropped the walls she'd built between them for a moment. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everything he had to say. "Vierick told me the truth. He said you were using me, that I'm just a tool for your peace treaty, a pawn to keep the alliance in check. Is that true?" He couldn't hide the hurt in his voice. He needed answers. He needed to know if everything had been fake, or if there was something real between them. For a moment, Soraya didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at him as if weighing her words. Daniel's heart sank as he waited for her to speak. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Vierick is wrong," she said quietly. "But he's not entirely wrong." Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he tried to process her words. "Yes, our marriage was meant to be a political move, but that doesn't mean I didn't care for you." He blinked, unsure if he had heard her right. "What?" He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You cared for me." Soraya stepped closer, her eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and vulnerability. "Yes, I cared for you. And I still do. But this marriage was never just about us. It was about my people, about peace, about keeping my throne safe." She paused, her expression softening. But somewhere along the way, it became about something more. About you. About me. About us. Daniel was speechless. He had always thought of her as cold, distant, and calculating. But in that moment, he saw something else. Honesty. She was admitting the truth, her feelings laid bare. "I didn't want this," she continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I didn't want to fall for you. But I did. And now, I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to make this right." Daniel stood still, feeling the weight of her confession settle in his chest. Soraya. He didn't know what to say. His feelings for her were a tangled mess. Anger, confusion, and something deeper. He had never expected this from her. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "I didn't want to be a pawn either. But here we are. And now we have to figure out what this is, together." Soraya's eyes softened, a flicker of something that resembled relief crossing her face. For the first time, she seemed like a woman, not just a princess. And in that moment, Daniel realized that maybe they weren't as trapped as they thought. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way for them to find a future together, one where they both had the freedom to choose their own path. As their eyes met, Daniel felt a spark of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least they were no longer pretending. They were ready to face the truth, together. The palace was quieter than usual the next morning. Daniel could feel the shift in the air, a change that neither he nor Soraya could ignore. The truth had been spoken, and now everything between them seemed different, real. But even as the weight of their conversation settled in, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something neither of them could control. Soraya had told him that there was more than just a political marriage, that she had feelings for him. But she was still a princess, and he was still a human outsider. Their bond, however strong it had become, was still tied to the fate of two warring worlds. It was far from simple, and the dangers were far from over. That afternoon, Daniel and Soraya stood together on the balcony of the palace, looking out over the vast city below. The skyline was filled with towering structures, and the air shimmered with the energy of 1,000 different lives. It was both beautiful and overwhelming. Daniel had never felt so small, so out of place. Soraya was unusually quiet beside him, her fingers tracing the edge of the balcony as if lost in thought. "The council is still wary of you," she said after a long silence, her voice calm but heavy. "There are some who still see you as a threat, an outsider who doesn't belong in Cyrelian politics." Daniel sighed, turning to look at her. "I'm used to being an outsider." He gave a small, bitter smile. "It's not like I asked for any of this." Soraya turned to him, her eyes soft but serious. "Neither did I." She paused before continuing. "But we don't have to keep living in the shadows. If we want peace, if we want a future together, we'll have to face the challenges head-on." He nodded, though the uncertainty still weighed heavily on his chest. "And what if we can't? What if the court doesn't accept us?" She met his gaze, her expression firm. "Then we make them accept us. Together." Her confidence was something he admired, but also something that frightened him. She was the princess, the one with all the power. She was used to commanding and controlling, while Daniel had spent his life in the shadows, following orders. Now, they were standing on equal ground, but the world around them was anything but. A voice broke the silence. "Your Majesties." It was one of Soraya's advisors, a tall, well-dressed Tyrellian with sharp features. He bowed respectfully before continuing. "There is a matter that requires your attention. Some factions within the council are stirring unrest." Daniel's stomach tightened. He knew this day was coming. The peace, fragile as it was under threat. The alliance between humanity and the Cyrelians might be enough to end the war, but it wasn't enough to erase the deep divides between their cultures. Soraya glanced at Daniel, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to the advisor. "We will address it. Leave us." The advisor bowed again and left without another word. As soon as he was gone, Soraya turned to Daniel. "This is the test. This is where we decide whether we're truly strong enough to make this work." Daniel nodded slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. He had never signed up for politics, never imagined he would find himself on the front lines of an alien world's future. But here he was, bound to a princess, bound to a world he didn't understand. But what he did understand was the one thing that had always kept him going: human resilience. He would not let fear control him. He would fight for his future, for their future, because, for the first time, he believed in something bigger than himself. And as Soraya reached out, her hand finding his, he realized they were no longer just allies. They were partners. They were fighting for each other, for two worlds that could never be the same again. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would shape a new future. The council meeting was set for the following morning, and Daniel's nerves were on edge. He had never been much for politics, and even less so in his very life. And the future of two entire worlds depended on the decisions made in that room. Soraya had made it clear that they needed to face the council's distrust head-on, but Daniel couldn't help feeling like he was walking into a lion's den. Every advisor, every noble, every voice in the room would be a challenge. But he wasn't about to back down now. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the bond that had formed between him and Soraya. They walked together through the grand halls of the palace, their footsteps echoing off the stone floors. Soraya walked with the grace and confidence of a ruler, while Daniel trailed behind, trying his best to keep up with the imposing pace. As they entered the council chamber, the murmurs of the Tyrellian nobles quieted, and all eyes turned to them. The room was large, with high vaulted ceilings and walls covered in intricate alien designs. A massive table sat at the center, surrounded by the faces of the most powerful people in the empire. Daniel felt the weight of their gazes, and it was all he could do to stand tall. Soraya took her seat at the head of the table, and Daniel followed her, sitting at her side. There was an uncomfortable silence before one of the council members, a tall, silver-skinned alien with dark eyes, stood up and addressed them. "This alliance has cost us much, Your Majesty," he said, his voice cold and skeptical. "We have accepted this human into our ranks, but there are many who still see him as a threat. How can we trust that this bond is truly for the good of the Tyrellian people?" Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. The room had become tense. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew this was the moment that would determine everything. Soraya's voice cut through the silence, firm and unwavering. "We are at the brink of something new," she began, her gaze sweeping over the council. "This alliance, this bond, was not built on lies or forced marriages. It was built on necessity, yes, but also on the possibility of a future where our worlds are no longer enemies." She turned to Daniel, her eyes softer now, more understanding than he had ever seen them. "Daniel has proven that he is not just a pawn in this game. He has saved our people, and now he stands here, willing to fight for peace. We must not let fear cloud our judgment." Daniel felt a surge of pride at her words. He wasn't just the human prince anymore. He was a partner in this, just as much a part of the future as Soraya and the Tyrellian Empire. But the council wasn't done yet. Another voice rose, more demanding this time. "And what of your loyalty, Soraya? How can we trust that you won't weaken our empire by aligning too closely with humans?" Daniel's breath caught. The room was closing in on them, and for a moment, it seemed like everything might unravel. But Soraya didn't flinch. She stood tall, her voice stronger than ever. "I have never been one to shy away from difficult choices," she said, her voice unwavering. "And my loyalty has always been to my people. This alliance is not just a political move. It is a chance for us to build something that will last. Together." The room fell silent. Soraya's words hung in the air, bold and powerful. She was no longer just a princess. She was a leader, someone willing to do what was necessary for the future. Finally, the council members looked at each other, the tension breaking. One by one, they nodded, some reluctantly, others with acceptance. The decision was made. Daniel realized, in that moment, that he wasn't alone. He had Soraya by his side, and together they would lead their people into a future neither of them had ever imagined. As the meeting adjourned, Daniel looked at Soraya. She gave him a small, almost unnoticeable smile, one that made his heart swell with something he hadn't expected. They had done it. The war was over. The alliance was stronger than ever, and for the first time, Daniel felt a deep, unshakable sense of hope for the future. He wasn't just a human anymore. He was a part of something greater. Together, they would change everything.